It was about 3.5 years ago. I was at a missions conference at the church where I was serving at the time, that we were having this conference, and I spoke with this representative from a missions agency that does missions all around our nation. And through that conversation, I spoke with this man about 30 minutes, and it was just one of those kind of God moment type conversations, if you ever have one of those, where we spoke for about 30 minutes, but it felt more like 30 seconds. And I just remember that night where he shared something with me that I felt set my wife and I and several other of us on a course of something that we probably never could imagine. That he shared with me that there's over 200 million unchurched people in our nation. He says if you were to put all of those together, it'd be the 11th largest nation in the world. And he said that the United States is the 4th largest mission field behind China, India, and Indonesia. And there was just something about that conversation that night that God began to spark something in our hearts that he was saying, I want you guys to be a part of doing something about that. And he set this in motion, and this idea that God wanted us to start a church to help reach those who were unchurched or maybe de-churched. They've been there, done that, and had given up on it, and create something that was fresh, that was real, and that connected and shared the story of Christ and how He could change their lives. And so as we kind of started praying about where God was leading us through some circumstances, God felt like God was putting on our hearts San Diego. Going on one of those first initial visits to San Diego, and we actually ended up right here in the place called Travel Lodge, because hey, I'd take my wife out. It is nothing but the best. But we ended up at the Travel Lodge, and I remember that night on one of those first initial visits, and one of the reasons we came here, because we heard there's over 3 million people in San Diego County, and that less than 6% are evangelical Christians. So you're talking about over 2.8 million people who are unchurched or non-evangelical. And so God began to press that on our hearts. And I remember being here that night after we kind of just gotten here, and my wife and I, and we just, that overwhelming feeling, that here's this huge city and we're way across the country. What in the world are we doing? And I remember that night just getting together, and it was kind of this overwhelming feeling like you're scared to death, but at the same time, this feeling like this sense of peace, that this was what God was calling us to do. And I remember laying out on the bed that night, my wife and I just praying, crying out to God, just seeking Him and what He wanted of us. And we just believing in all of our hearts that God was leading us here to start a church. And that night after I got up, we prayed. And I remember opening my Bible and just reading these words in Deuteronomy 28. And it says this in verse 1, "If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all His commands I give you today." And it says this in verse 2, "All these blessings will come upon you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God. And you will be blessed in the city and blessed in the country." I remember that night. I remember God just speaking so clear to me and saying, "Kevin, you're right. You can't do this, but I can. And if you will only trust and obey me, I will bless you in this city and in this country and what I want to do through you and through these people and starting this church for His glory."
Oh God, rise up in us. We'll show the world how you love Jesus, and take heart and make it yours. Salvation reign over us. The fight was won on the cross. We take heart, for you have overcome the world.
And now as I look back, we're over 2 years into starting Elevate, and I look back and I almost shudder at the thought at what I would have missed if that night I'd have let fear or something else cave in and say, you know what, I'm not going to take the step of faith. And I shudder at the thought of what we would have missed, to seeing over 40 people give their lives to Christ since we started, sending a mission team to Nicaragua, giving thousands and thousands of dollars away to help missions around the nation and around the world. the things that we even experienced this past Easter and seeing over 200 people come to Easter and many people giving their lives to Christ on that day. To see a couple that, came to Elevate, gave their life to Christ, baptized, got connected within Elevate, and now are going overseas to do missions in Honduras. And I almost shudder to think, what happens if that night we say, you know what, man, I'm not sure the comfort and the familiarity of where we are, I was staying that, but instead we said, you know what, God's calling us to something greater. God's calling us to step into the unknown. But what happens that evening if instead we say, what if? And as I look back and I just shudder to think about what I would have missed. And I am thankful that we continue to step out into the unknown, trusted that God's plans were bigger and better than we could have ever imagined. As I mentioned earlier, we came to start Elevate Church. One of the things for us was we could not live with what if. When we felt that God was calling and leading us out, we had to decide, will we let fear or doubt or just the comfort and for where we were override this sense of faith and that God was calling us to something bigger and something greater than we could ever imagine. And I believe at the end of our lives, the biggest regrets that we will have are not the mistakes that we've made, but more so the things that we didn't do that we wish we would have done. In other words, I believe some of the greatest regrets that we'll have at the end of our lives will be some what ifs. What if I would have taken that job? What if I would have talked to that person? What if I'd have went to that place? And so today I want to talk to you about the primary thing that holds people back from taking that step of faith. And as we're talking about the idea of labels, I feel like many of us wear a label of fear or doubt when God has called us to wear this label of faith and trusting in Him and who He is and what He's done, and that He can seriously do more than you could ever think or imagine. Today I want to talk about turning your fear into faith. So in Luke chapter 5 was an incredible story that stood out to me several weeks ago. And I want to read to you today part of Luke chapter 5. And this is a story where Jesus is teaching some people, and we pick up when He has an encounter with Simon Peter. Listen to what He says. As we talk about turning fear into faith, in verse 4 He said, "When He had finished speaking, He said to Simon, 'Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch.'" So number one, if you want to take notes today, number one about turning your fear into faith is that I must embrace uncertainty. I must embrace uncertainty. Jesus was calling Simon out into the deep water. Now, what happens in the deep water? In the deep water, there's lots of questions, right? There's questions of like, how deep will it be? Will I be able to touch anymore? Can I actually swim in this water? There's questions about and doubts of what's going to happen when I step out into the deep water, as it were, in our lives. But Jesus many times calls us out into the deep, because I want you to know that's where Jesus is. Jesus is in the deep water. He's when the certainty of the shallow water, but God is calling us to get out of the kiddie pool, because that is where incredible things happen in our life. And I love what happens here. In verse 5, Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything." So what's Peter saying? Peter's saying, listen, hey, we've worked hard all night. I'm a professional fisherman, and we haven't caught a thing, Jesus. So listen, that's the facts of his current situation. And I want to let you know today, maybe the facts of your current situation is that you're lonely. But the truth is that you have a friend in Jesus that sticks closer than a brother. The fact may be that you're running out of money. The truth is that God provides for all of our needs according to His glorious riches in Christ Jesus. That's the truth. The fact may be that your marriage is falling apart today, but the truth is that we have a solid rock, which is Christ and who I stand. So what we've got to begin to do is shift from the facts of our current situation, that it's the deep water. It's that I haven't caught anything all night, Jesus. That understanding instead the truth of who He is. And this is what Simon comes to realize. Listen to this. He says this in the second part of verse 5, but because you say so, I'll let down the nets. Key thought there. It wasn't faith in himself. It wasn't faith in positive thinking. I want to make that clear today, that Simon had faith in a person who is Jesus, and he was trusting in the truth of who Jesus is, not the facts of his current situation. So when the facts of your current situation doesn't match up to the truth of who you know is in you and can do incredible things in you, you've got to still trust who lives inside of you. So he says, but because you say so. This isn't a positive, thinking state of mind. This isn't, hold on to your feelings. It's a sense of hold on to your faith in Jesus, the solid rock. So he says, because you, what a key thought there, he's going to do it. And oftentimes, I'm sure Simon may be thinking a thought here that what we see as a setback, though, we've got to understand that many times is nothing more than a setup for greater works of God's glory in your life. And this is the point where Simon hasn't caught anything all night. So we see, number one, we've got to embrace uncertainty, willing to walk outside of our current comfort zone, willing to walk outside of familiar territory and into the unknown to follow Christ there into the deep water. But take a note in number two. Number two is that faith is the bridge between what is and what could be. Write that down this morning. Listen to verse 6. It says, and when they had done so. I love that. Verse 5, but because you say so, Lord, I'll throw out the nets. That's what he's calling all of us to do. And in verse 6, faith is the bridge between what is and what could be. In verse 6, he says, and when they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. Wow, what an incredible thought. Faith is the bridge between your current reality and what God is about to do in your life. As you step out into the unknown and the uncertainty of where you are, I want you to understand today, faith is not a drug to sedate you through life. It's not, let's just kind of hold down and hunker down and kind of see if we can hold on until Jesus comes back, or, until I get to heaven, I'm just going to kind of hold down here. No. Faith is a force that transports you into another realm of reality, that God wants to do something so incredible. And this is what Simon saw in his life. This was a shift in the story. And just like God wants to do a shift in your life today, He wants to turn your but because you say so into when they had done so. What's that? When they obeyed what God told them to do, then that's when they saw that nets begin to break. You want to see nets break in your life and God do the unexplainable? It's when you obey, but because you say so, Lord. And wherever that leads you, it's because you say so. And then you step out and say, I am going to go for that. I want you to understand, faith is not the absence of fear and doubt. All faith is it eclipses it, or it overtakes it one step at a time. And God is not telling you to have faith for the whole journey. God is just asking, will you have faith to take the first step? What is it for you today? God's saying, listen, will you have faith to take the first step? Number 3, when it comes to turning your fear into faith, is that we've got to understand this. This is something that I read before we moved out to San Diego, and it's something that helped me. It says that the greatest opportunities and blessings of God lie on the other side of some of the greatest risks that you will ever take. just like that day when we were in the hotel room, we're praying, we're crying out to God and just believing Him and hearing His voice speaking to our hearts of that idea of, Kevin, you're right, you can't, but I can. And very early on, we learned something, that if we wanted to see God do something great, we wanted to see God do something that was beyond what we could even do on our own efforts, and understanding that we knew it was going to involve risk. And here's what you need to know, is that one step of faith can be the ripple effect of something way beyond you could ever imagine in your life of God doing. I would have never known that over 3.5 years later, I'd be sitting in this room, or that we'd be holding a worship service every single week at this place. But God does the extraordinary when you step out and take the risk. Listen to how it's said in verse 7. So we heard how he dropped the nets, even though it didn't make sense. The nets are breaking because of the fish that God has blessed them with. And then verse 7 says, so they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. What an incredible thought. Nets are breaking, boats are sinking. God is doing incredible things in this situation, and we've got to understand this. This is something that we've been learning in the process as well, is that there is no shortage of God's supply. The only shortage could come in the fact of your willingness to obey and by faith of what He's saying to do. There's only a shortage in your capacity to believe Him. Listen to what it says here in verse 8. When Simon saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees. He says, go away from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man. For he and all his companions were astonished at what God has done. And then he says this, don't be afraid, Jesus said, from now on you will catch men. He was saying, from now on, you've got this greater life that you have never known up to this point. And he says, so they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed Him. In other words, listen, they didn't know at the moment, but they were seconds away from the most purposeful, life-changing moments that their life has ever known. This set Peter on a course that he could have never imagined. Just like in our lives, God set us on a course that we could have never imagined. Now as I look back, I think about what all we would have missed of the incredible things God has done. Or even many of you that are sitting out there that God has allowed us to get to know and build relationships with and see your lives change. And I could not imagine missing those blessings and those opportunities as my joy to be your pastor and to see the incredible things that God is doing through each of us. So in closing, I want to ask you this question, a question that all of us have to deal with and wrestle in our lives. This question. Am I willing to trust Christ enough to follow Him into the unknown? This is where He was calling Peter. They dropped everything and followed Jesus. Are we willing to say, in the midst of the questions, in the midst of maybe some doubts, in the midst of the uncertainty, to say, yes, Lord, because you say so, and that we would still follow Him into that place? Listen, church, I believe as a church collectively that God has done incredible things, but I believe God is calling us even into deeper waters, to take more risk, to step out even to more unknown and unfamiliar territory, and to take more ground for Christ than we have ever seen over the next several months and upcoming year. And that God is going to blow our minds as we just obey that simple call. But because you say so. And I believe we're going to see nets break, and we're going to see boats sink, and the blessings of God as we take even greater risk of what He wants to do. And here's what we've got to understand as a church, and even for your life personally, is that faith precedes evidence. Believing precedes seeing, and obedience precedes the blessing. In other words, the greatest opportunities and blessings of God lie on the other side of the greatest risk that even you will take today. So here's the question for you. Will you follow Christ in the unknown? And will you say, listen, what is that thing? I believe with each of you in here today that there is something that God is telling you today that you need to do. What's the risk you need to take? Maybe for you, it's time for you to send the email. Maybe for you, it's saying, listen, you need to finish the resume and send it out. Maybe for you, it's a phone call that you need to make. Maybe for you, it's a relationship that you know is messed up and that you need to go after today and take the risk and do what you need to do to reconcile it today. Maybe it's something else for you. What is it? I'm saying make the phone call, send the email, Go talk to that person. Do what you need to do and what God is leading you out to do today. So church, as we close, I just want to challenge you today. What is it that God is telling you to do today? And will you answer that question as it says, am I willing to trust Christ enough to follow Him into the unknown? May we turn fear into faith and say, yes, Lord, because you say so.